Good morning. I'm Darrell West, a senior fellow in the Government Studies program at the Brookings Institution, and I am pleased to welcome you to our webinar on the future of election reform. 2024 was an eventful year from the standpoint of many things. We saw the election of Donald Trump as president and Republican majorities in the House and Senate. But there also have been election reform measures on the ballot in many states. So what we're going to do today is to look at what happened with those ballot measures and discuss what the results tell us about election reform going forward. There were two promising reforms that have been advocated for many years. That includes one, open primaries, in which independents can vote either in Republican or Democratic primaries, or in some states in kind of an all-encompassing primary with independents, Republicans, and Democrats being able to participate. And then two, the instant reform or ranked choice voting reform, in which people can express preferences for several different candidates, and then their preferences get tabulated in sequence. The lowest ranked candidate gets dropped, the results get retabulated until somebody generates a majority. And the goal with ranked choice voting or instant runoffs is to encourage more moderate candidates and more civil rhetoric in election campaigns. Now, the short summary of what happened in 2024 is it turned out not to be a great year for election reform. In most of the places except for DC, voters rejected the reforms. In Alaska, Alaska did narrowly preserve a ranked choice voting, but it was a very narrow margin of about 600 votes. Open primaries have been seen more favorably by voters than instant runoffs. Montana was actually an interesting state because it actually had two separate measures, one on open primaries and the other on instant runoffs. In most of the other states, those two things were combined. But the results showed that in Montana, open primaries actually had about 10 percentage point higher support from voters than was true for ranked choice voting. In fact, in Montana, the open primaries measure just lost very narrowly by about 51 to 49%, whereas the ranked choice voting lost overwhelmingly by 60 to 40. Montana's more conservative state, the fact that open primaries almost won there suggests there actually is hope for that going forward in other states, especially more moderate states and states that might have more of a history of election reform. This week, I put out a new Brookings paper that assesses these 2024 election reform ballot measures. I look at the 7 states plus DC that had election reform on the ballot, plus 2 states, Alaska and Missouri, which proposed to get rid of instant runoffs or to ban them permanently. In the paper, I examined exit poll data from a number of the states and also undertook short case studies of what happened in terms of the campaign discussions, levels of campaign finance, how the partisan forces arrayed, and so on. There obviously were different situations in each of the states, but there, I think, were a few common elements across all of the states. One, I argue in the paper, that the language of reform actually matters. For example, in the exit polls, voters did say that they found the terminology of ranked choice voting complicated and sometimes confusing. Some people also argued in the exit polls that ranked choice voting violated what they viewed as traditional democratic principles of one person, one vote, which is kind of an interesting reaction because in each round of vote tabulations under instant runoffs, people only are allowed one vote. But somehow in the election campaign, people came to the conclusion that if in instant runoffs you were able to express preferences for multiple candidates, that actually gave you more votes than somebody who just expressed a preference for one. Secondly, I argue that the funding mechanisms mattered. In several of the states, there was large out-of-state financial interests who put substantial amounts of money into promoting election reform. So these were groups, organizations, and individuals who were advocating reform. This became a contentious issue in several states. Some of the opponents of ballot reform took advantage of this to basically argue, hey, don't let those large financial interests, billionaires, out-of-state interests dictate what you do and how you decide this. They argued that all the money pouring in on one side should make voters suspicious of the actual reform. And I found it interesting, even in Colorado, which of course is a more moderate state, Senator Michael Bennet, who actually is a pro-election reform individual, and he has co-sponsored bills in the Senate on election reform, complained about all the pro-reform money that flooded into his state. So the money issue definitely seems to have played a role. And in the exit polls, a number of voters did cite that as an issue. And then the last point that I will mention, and we're going to get into this more in our discussion, election reform this year became enmeshed in partisan politics as party organizations in various states opposed the ballot measures. In a number of the states, especially the ones that are Republican dominated, it was the GOP who opposed the reform. Interestingly, here in Washington, D.C., where I am based, it was the Democratic Party establishment that came out against it. The mayor opposed it. The chair of the city council opposed it. And interestingly, even though the ballot measure passed fairly substantially, it had a provision in it that basically said this reform is not going to go into effect unless the city council actually appropriates money to support the reform. And at this point, I don't know whether the city council actually is going to do it. But in DC, there actually was support for this. So those were just a few things that jumped out at me as I looked across the states. You can read the full paper at brookings.edu if you want additional details and results from the exit polls. Now, to help us understand these issues, we're delighted to have three distinguished experts with us today. Seth Mascott is a professor of political science and director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver, although I should note he's actually on sabbatical this year at Vanderbilt University, so he's actually joining us from Nashville. Sarah Anderson is a professor in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California at Santa Barbara. So she is joining us bright and early California time. Sarah, we appreciate your dedication joining us at 7 a.m. California time as she's written on the bipartisan path to effective lawmaking and why legislators should fear or why legislators often do fear primary elections. And then our last panelist is Megan Verlew, who is the public affairs editor at Colorado Public Radio. She spent considerable time covering the Colorado ballot campaign. If you have questions for our panelists, you can email them to us at events@brookings.edu, and we will try to answer as many of them as possible. So, Megan, I'd like to start with you. You covered the Colorado ballot measure. And I know in September, there was a pre-election survey in Colorado that found voters saying they supported election reform by 64 to 25%. So obviously an overwhelming margin in favor. But on election day, that ballot measure lost by 55 to 45%. So that was a drop of almost 20 percentage points during the campaign. So I'd love to get your perspective on why did election reform fail in Colorado, which is a state I would typically expect to be a little more moderate and a little more favorable to election reform.
So I think a lot of things came together, a lot of the strands that you just mentioned in terms of concerns about where the money came from. One thing that's interesting in Colorado is that the big money wasn't out of state. It was an in-state multi-millionaire, Kent Thiry, who bankrolled this. Kent Thiry's bankrolled a lot of election reforms that have passed here, but there is a narrative out there that, oh, is this helping him for a run for governor someday? He actually said to our journalist that he had given up that ambition to kind of defang that criticism. But you know, you had one person who could be very identified with the funding for this measure in a way that I think voters get very uncomfortable with. In Colorado, where the elections are generally decided by Democratic voters these days, I think what you saw happen, the exit polling shows us that older Democratic voters were skeptical of this. And I think the party did a very good job of messaging to its own members, the Democratic Party, saying this is confusing, saying you like our election system, you're proud of it, you're proud of all mail voting, you're proud of all these reforms we've done. This might jeopardize it. And our election officials across the political spectrum were also saying that they were worried about administering these elections. So you had a group that has high trust among Democratic voters saying, we're a little nervous about this. And the one this is anecdotal, but I would I actually think this resonated. The opponents got out a very broad a text message to a lot of Democratic voters. I heard about it from multiple people from Elizabeth Warren. And I think she carried weight with the older demographic that ended up voting against this in terms of, oh, Elizabeth Warren, she doesn't stand for the corrupt party apparatus. If she tells me this is a bad idea, maybe I need to give this a second look. So I think that Colorado Democrats were very savvy and other opposing forces, but especially folks on the Democratic side, were very savvy in how they reached their voters and moved enough of their voters away from this that we saw it fail by a pretty decent margin.
That is very interesting, and it's fascinating the age differentials that you just noted and the role that Senator Warren played here. So, Seth, I'd love to bring you into this discussion as well. I know you've long followed Colorado politics, but you also follow election reform more generally across the country. Why do you think voters rejected election reform in a number of different states?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks to Brookings for hosting this and inviting me. And Daryl, I really appreciate reading your memo on this. I thought it was really nicely put together. And I certainly agree with what Megan had said about this. Just going through all these results, basically we saw some version of reform, either top 4, top 5, with some measure of ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting, failed in 6 states. Alaska's system just barely survived an attempt to repeal it. DC is the only place where this really saw success this year. And it's interesting because, to me, you could find some sort of state-specific effects going on. There was some bits of trickery in some places. There might have been confusing wording, competing ballot measures. But it's still pretty striking that these reforms went down everywhere. When ballot reform has generally been pretty popular on states that it's come up, particularly in Colorado, but not exclusively there. The basis for election reform is still there. That is, most Americans are still not happy with election systems. They're still open to change. And they've usually been able to support these things even if they don't fully understand them in the past. I think sort of just overall things in this that made this cycle different from previous ones in terms of ballot reform is that there were few pretty public examples of either ranked choice voting or some version of it in the past few years that I think have had somewhat negative resonance with American voters. One was the New York City mayoral example from 2021. A number of cities have RCV, but New York invariably gets the most attention for it. It was, in some ways, it was kind of a silly election, and Eric Adams has not gotten a ton of great press following it. That might make some people think, maybe this didn't pick the best candidate. You have Alaska's example from 2022, which made a lot of Republicans very upset. You essentially have 2 Republicans on that ballot, including Sarah Palin. Democrat Mary Peltola ends up winning. And a number of voters find that very confusing and don't understand how a Democrat could win in this very Republican state. And then related to this, you have, Donald Trump outwardly opposing ranked choice voting. He, gives statements saying this is confusing. This is part of voter fraud that I've been telling you about. This, stopping some of these initiatives became actually a priority for the MAGA movement. And deployed some MAGA rhetoric and money against these issues in a few states. One of the anti-reform messages in Montana, as I read, was a warning. It says they have open borders, they want open bathrooms, they need open primaries. Okay, just sort of tying a lot of partisan messaging to open primaries, to ballot reform in general. So my overall impression is that this has become, just ballot reform in general, has become a much more partisan issue than it used to be. It used to be that some of these things would pass with both Democratic and Republican votes, even if it was more popular on the Democratic side. For example, I was just looking at in some Colorado elections. So back in 2016 in Colorado, the election reform that created the election system that Colorado has today, where you have these semi-open primaries that independents can participate in, you have an all-mail-in primary ballot. That reform got 56% of the vote in Colorado in 2016. Hillary Clinton was also on the ballot that year. She got 53%. Okay. So the reform was more popular than the Democratic presidential candidate. Some Republicans voted for it. Contrast that with this year. You have the top 4 measures on the Colorado ballot. That gets 46% of the vote. Kamala Harris gets 56. So in this case, the reform is well underperforming the Democratic ballot. And it's also similarly, if you look at Washington, D.C.'s result, the reform passed in D.C., but it got 73% of the vote. Kamala Harris got 90%. So it's underperforming Democrats. And it's interesting, to compare, just to get a little technical, if you know, like something about correlations, the correlation of the vote at the county level in Colorado, 2016, the vote for president and the ballot reform, the correlation was 0.77. In 2024, the correlation was 0.94. That just means they're much more closely tied together than they used to be. Another way of saying this, in 2016, in Colorado, Trump won 42 of Colorado's 64 counties. In 2024, he won 41 of those counties, almost the exact same counties. But back in 2016, if Trump won a county, the ballot reform measure won in 31 of them and lost in 11 of them. It was, it was a little more split. In this year, if Trump won a county, the ballot reform initiative lost in every one of those counties. So my big takeaway is that election reform has just become much more explicitly partisan. This was a Republican-leaning electorate nationwide this year, and that just made ballot reform a lot harder to pass.
I think you're right that somehow this year ballot reform did get enmeshed in partisan politics in a very negative way. And of course, you mentioned Trump's opposition to this. In several states, there were exit poll results that basically blamed this idea on being a California style reform, and then used that California motto kind of against the reform movement. So I think in a lot of respects, there were some interesting ways in which the opponents of reform came out against it. Sarah, I want to draw you into the conversation and just get your sense of what went wrong with election reform this year.
Thank you. This is a really, really interesting conversation, and I'm glad we're having it. I think it's really important to think about these together, which we're doing, which I really appreciate because they can be thought about separately at each state. I think a couple of points I want to make. One is to just draw on Seth's point that this has just become more partisan. And I'll give another example and then talk a little bit about that. So Nevada actually was an interesting case because Nevada, in order to implement reforms, had to vote twice to implement the reforms. Passed them in the prior round, and then they didn't pass in this round. And I think that's just to give more emphasis to this point that these kinds of reforms have become more polarized, more tied to the partisan system. And when you have really, really close elections, from that perspective, they're failing in part, I think, because of that. Likewise, I think the other way that they really have become tied to that more nationalized conversation is that there has been a lot of elite rhetoric around voting in the last couple of elections, actually. And these kinds of reforms don't help to resolve those issues for most voters. So the issues that are being raised about elections are about who votes, right? In particular, about whether your vote gets counted. And these kinds of election reforms are obviously not aimed directly at that issue. And in fact, they might seem complicating around who votes and how, right? To this, and I think you make this point really well when you talk about voters thinking that it violates a one person, one vote sort of rationale for voting, because they are confusing to some voters. So I think that's right. It's nationalized. And then I think the second point I want to make that we often forget, especially in rooms that are interested in election reform broadly, is that incumbents, anybody who's gotten elected in the current system, usually doesn't want reform. They managed to figure out how to get elected in the way it was. And so these are really, I think, more of an uphill battle than reformers at least sometimes remember when they give a very reasonable rationale for why maybe ranked choice voting makes a lot more sense, because you get to vote your preferences really easily. You're not just having to make one choice. But actually incumbents have figured out how to use the current system. And so in some work with Dan Butler and Laurel Harbridge, we look at how incumbents have figured out how to win in primary elections by running, really paying attention to that primary electorate. That these reforms are very scary if you have found a way to appease enough people to get elected, because suddenly everything shifts and it's much more difficult to figure out how to get elected. And so while an incumbent is, of course, not going to come out and say, I oppose election reform because I'm worried about my chances when the system shifts, that's underpinning this. These are the folks who know how to use the current system. So I think that really has come out in this last round as this has become a more prominent issue. I'll stop there. I have a lot more thoughts about election reform and what has happened and what might happen. And I'm looking forward to continuing to have this conversation with all of you.
That's great. And you will have other opportunities to express your views. So I'd like to get into some of the more detailed exit poll results. And in the Brookings paper that I put out yesterday, we detail them. And so if people want more of the details, I'll refer them to the paper. But just a few highlights. As I mentioned before, Montana had the 2 ballot measures, one on open primaries, one on instant runoffs. The open primaries idea ran about 10 percentage points higher. So it does suggest voters are able to distinguish different types of reforms and to make different kinds of decisions based on them. In the Colorado exit poll, there was something that I found very fascinating, because the exit poll asked people about the reform ideas in particular. 55% of people in Colorado said they favored open primaries. 52% said they favored instant runoffs. So the 2 ideas actually had majority support in the exit poll. But then the exit poll, which obviously was trying to measure what actually happened in the election, the ballot reform measure lost by 54 to 46, which is almost identical to the actual election loss of 55 to 45%. So in the very same exit poll, you basically have people liking the substance of the reform ideas, but then saying they voted against it. So, and then when asked in particular why they voted no, in a number of the different states, there were lots of different issues: too complicated, confusing, the large money, it being a California reform idea. Republicans would complain this benefits Democrats, and therefore that was unfair. In some places, people said it would cost more money to run elections if you had this complicated ballot measure. And then, as Seth mentioned, in Montana, there were ads run that basically said open borders, open bathrooms, open primaries. And I thought, wow, what an amazing election narrative to link together immigration, transgender issues, and election reform. Like, I would typically not think of those 3 issues as being related, but in Montana, they were from a messaging standpoint. And that seemed to matter a lot. So the question I'd like to ask each of you is just, as we kind of look at the actual campaigns, the messaging, the role of money, and the strategies that different people pointed out, I'm just curious, what do those exit poll results tell us about where voters are? And would love to get your reaction. So we'll start with Megan, and then go to Seth and Sarah on that.
I have to say, on that Montana slogan, some political ad writer will be in demand for the next 10 years for coming up with that slogan. That person has guaranteed themselves some very steady employment, I think. The exit polling is fascinating. And one of the things that I saw in the exit polling you cited in your paper that I found really interesting was also how late Coloradans decided on this initiative. We had um, we sit in the newsroom and we watch the early returns because we're a ballot state, and so we're always watching how quickly people are turning in their ballots. And this election, people held on to their ballots much longer than in 22 and 20 and 18, and we were trying to figure out what was going on with that. I'm not saying they all held it because they didn't know how they wanted to vote on this, but um, it's striking to me that people took their time on their ballots, and this seems to be one of the reasons why. And I think one thing you saw across our ballot here in Colorado is a anti-complexity vote. And so to explain in my own mind what happened with ranked choice voting, one thing I look at is a totally different ballot measure we had. It was put there by the legislature, and it would have given our county clerks an extra week to get ballots ready. It moved some election deadlines around. Really formulaic. It was approved by 99 out of 100 lawmakers. Seemed like the kind of thing that everybody should just check a box and vote yes, because there's no opposition to it. It failed rather significantly. And the only thing I can think of there is that the language wasn't intuitive. It's the kind of thing that as a voter you might look at and go, what are the unintended consequences here? It's safer to vote no. And I think that happened to the all-party primary ranked choice voting measure too, that even voters who were like, conceptually, I like this, enough of them looked at it and said, I really don't know what this is actually going to do. I don't know if I'm approving a giant mess for my state where I'm generally happy with how elections are going. And again, this is on the Democratic side. The Republican side did a really good job of mobilizing their people to feel that this was something to reject out of hand. But I think really what we might have seen is a large anti-complexity vote that is going to be a major hurdle for election reformers if you want to get this through the electorate. People are very skeptical about causing unintended consequences in their laws. And so that vote, I think, is kind of growing, at least here in Colorado.
Now, that is interesting, your view that this was an anti-complexity thing. Seth, what are your reactions to the exit poll results?
Yeah, I agree with what Megan said there. I would note, and this is from some research I did years ago. If there's newer stuff that I'm missing, I hope Sarah will correct me on this. But my impression is that unlike polling on candidates, which tends to be pretty stable throughout an election, polling on initiatives can actually be highly variable, which means like voters have an initial impression, but that can actually be moved around quite a bit. And we saw that in Colorado, where polls just a few months before the election showed this thing that ended up failing with huge margins, with like a 20% advantage going into the election season. And part of that, we know that people's votes on initiatives, they might like the idea. They can be moved toward a no on it. First of all, if there's a lot of spending, which in many of these cases there was. And second of all, if there's confusion. Now, it's fairly easy to create confusion about this was a pretty complex set of reforms. In a number of places, this involved multiple stages. This was both changing to a nonpartisan primary and adding ranked choice voting to the runoff. So it was multiple steps. In Colorado, there was some talk about whether this actually needed to be two initiatives, as it was in Montana. Whether it violates the single subject rule for initiatives or not, if they're all together. It's a large thing, so it's fairly easy to demonize as confusing and complex. And most voters, rather than vote for something really complicated, they will just stick with the status quo. And the spending was pretty substantial. And it's pretty interesting to note that, as you did, Daryl, that the substance of these initiatives, even in Colorado, was actually still pretty popular, even by people who ended up voting against it. I would say that doesn't necessarily mean that these things can't pass in the future. I think they can. Stopping them won't always be as big a priority for the anti-side. And I think the fact that this was a presidential year was really important, that ate up a lot of the oxygen in the room. It made for a much more partisanly oriented election. In a midterm election, it'll be different. In off-years elections, it could be different. Where you won't necessarily have such a nationally polarized issue at stake.
Okay, terrific. Sarah, your thoughts on the exit poll results?
I also picked up on one of the results that you highlight, which is that 62% of people thought that one of them was confusing. I also tend to find it confusing, but I'll just say two things about that. One is that after the Alaska election reform, there was polling looking at whether people actually found the voting confusing, and they didn't seem to find the voting confusing. They seemed to find it actually pretty straightforward to go down a ballot and say what kind of order you wanted your candidates in, what your preferences were. So I think that confusion, as these become more common and as people kind of have more experience with them, which started to happen certainly in this election cycle with so many states considering them, may go away. And then the second thing that makes me think that confusion may actually come down is that I happened to be in Ireland during their last election. My daughter is going to college there. And I got to talk to a lot of people. I was not technically doing research, but I just talked to a lot of people about the election because that's what they wanted to talk about. And what was interesting to me is I would say, and then what happens with that like second choice, if your first choice candidate doesn't make it in, how does that work? And they would say, I don't really remember exactly how that works. They thought of it as voting. They knew how to vote. And they didn't worry about a lot of those details anymore. Now, of course, they've had the system for a long time and, they don't have to. But I thought that was very interesting. They just call it voting. They don't call it ranked choice voting. They don't call it anything complicated. They call it voting. And so, some of that confusion as these ideas percolate into conversation may actually go down, which makes me a little optimistic. Also with Seth, that some of these reforms will begin to get some traction as that part at least goes away.
Okay, my most important questions for you now are, what does the 2024 experience portend for election reform going forward? What lessons should we draw from what happened this year? Megan, we'll start with you.
Well, obviously a lot of recalibration on the side of folks putting measures like this on the ballot. Seth mentioned the kind of electorate that came out, and I do think that it was an interesting choice for so many places to go for this in a presidential year. In Colorado, the conventional wisdom is if you want something, looking at the exit polling, the younger voters are more open to this. So if you want this to pass, you're going to need to look for a year where you've got a stronger younger electorate. The conventional wisdom in Colorado is you try to legalize a drug, and then younger voters will come out and vote for that. But we've legalized kind of all the drugs we can for a while. So I don't know what else backers of this might look to kind of coattail on the ballot. We have all of our statewide elections in 2 years, and it'll be interesting to see if election reform comes back then, when I think Democrats will be more kind of motivated around choosing their statewide offices. I think the messaging's got to change, obviously, in terms of how it's explained, in terms of probably being more concrete. When I talk to people in my own life trying to explain this to them, and they said, well, how would this really work? The example I kept coming up with is I don't think Lauren Boebert will still be in Congress if Colorado had this, because she went through a very competitive Republican primary. She only got a plurality of the vote. If we had ranked choice voting and she was on the ballot in the fall with one or two other Republicans, Republican voters and moderate voters in her district would have more of a chance to make their voices heard versus only having this determined in the Republican primary. An example like that, I think voters can grasp onto. Obviously, the people pushing our measure weren't going to make that because they don't want to look partisan and they don't want to look like we're going after certain people. But I think the examples have to get a lot more concrete for people to see how this plays out through the system. And that having one example from Alaska doesn't necessarily, kind of do it. The Mary Pelota election was really, really interesting, but I think voters are going to need to see this in action a lot more.
Well, it does suggest, based on what you said about young people favoring these types of reforms, that the longer term prognosis may actually be a little brighter if the messaging can improve. But Seth, would love to get your thoughts on lessons for future election reform.
Yeah, thanks. I also agree. I think it's important for advocates to uh, be thoughtful about choosing their electorates, choosing when and where they're trying to run these things. I think it's pretty likely that 2026 is a more Democratic year than 2024 was, and probably an electorate that's going to be more favorable to these sorts of reforms. Certainly, in a place like Colorado, where it's there's going to be a lot of the constitutional officers up. It will likely have more of a Democratic cant to it, but that will be true in a lot of states. I think it would be really important for reform efforts to get some of the party leaders on board. I don't think of Michael Bennet as that big a national figure, but within Colorado politics, I think he's taken pretty seriously and seen as a pretty sober person, not given to a lot of crazy outbursts. And the fact that he opposed this made a lot of Democrats think twice about it. I also I'm really am wondering about the messaging, and that obviously is something that I think advocates should be thinking a lot about. Because complexity is something that remains a big target, and just by its nature, this is a somewhat complex reform. So I sort of wonder I think you need to go one direction or the other. That is, lean toward making it a much simpler reform that people can understand. Like we're just doing top four, or we're just doing RCV, and do it sort of incrementally, or just saying this is a massive reform package. And here's like 3 initiatives that we need to pass together and make that part of the messaging. I don't know that there's a history for something like that, but it could theoretically work. But you go for the top 4, top 5. You go for RCV, maybe even go for multi-member districts, and do things that can enable more parties to be more successful in different parts of the country. But the way things are, I think it's fairly easy to demonize this as it's complicated and something just doesn't seem right.
It also suggests perhaps we should separate open primaries from instant runoffs, especially since open primaries seem more popular. But Sarah, your thoughts on lessons going forward?
Absolutely. I come from now an open primary state where we don't talk about that anymore, which I think is a lesson in itself. These things tend to be potentially controversial at the moment, but then to become the normal. And so I think that's going to happen as more states consider these things, as voters have seen them on ballots. It's going to become a different conversation, and that makes me think that it will have some potential in some of these places. The second thing, I am, one of the wonderful things about American democracy is the states, and this way that the states are and have been thought of for a long time, since sort of the beginning of this design, as laboratories of democracy. And they have been, when they don't pass things, they aren't laboratories of democracy. So that's one thing. And as a political scientist, anyway, who wants to understand the effects of these, I really want states to be experimenting with these. So I'm curious whether, not that an experiment is a particularly appealing rhetoric, but I am curious what will happen as states themselves, as the strategists, think through some of the logic that Seth laid out. Should we just do open primaries? What happens when we do that? Then other states do tend to learn from each other. And so I see us as being in a new and learning moment around electoral reforms like this. And so again, that makes me a little bit optimistic, because I think states will learn from each other. Now, they'll also learn from the open rhetoric, that there are some opportunities for opposition as well. And so maybe one way to characterize where we are in this moment is it is an early moment and a not very defined moment yet, and it will become more defined. We will build these pathways and have these conversations in ways that are likely to really change as we get more experience with reforms.
You know, it is interesting. Open used to be considered a really good word and a word that would move voters in a positive way. This year, that turned out not to be the case. But we're going to move to our audience Q&A section now. And if people have questions, you can submit them at events@brookings.edu. That's emailing us events@brookings.edu. And we will try to get to as many questions as possible. We have some questions that have come in so far. And the first one actually deals with this issue of open primaries. How do we achieve open primaries across many of the states? I know there are places like New York that is considering open primary reform for the 2026 ballot. I imagine there are other states that might be doing the same thing. Is this a route that the pro-reform people should consider going forward? Any of you who would like to respond to that?
I mean, the exit polling and what I was hearing on the ground is that that's a piece that makes sense to people and is easier. I do wonder about its long-term satisfaction, because you will end up, as we've seen in California, with races that are single party. And in that case, we've talked about how Republicans have come to oppose this. For Colorado Republicans, there's no upshot to a double Democratic gubernatorial race. Then they don't get to get their message out to the broadest electorate. They're sort of sidelined in June. So I think it might find purchase with the electorate here, but it's not gonna be without strong opposition.
Yeah, I think this question about open primaries depends a lot on how we see partisanship going forward. So to what extent are we seeing this sort of polarization continue to occur in the electorate? And to what extent is the electorate becoming what we call affectively polarized, loving their party and hating the other party? Because that is a big part of the story of open, right? Open primaries being really effectively nonpartisan. They're not nonpartisan. The candidates are partisan, but taking away power from parties. If you love your party and hate the other party, you might not want that. If you hate both parties, you might love that. And as the electorate, which has been, I will say, less polarized than elites, so maybe more generally accepting of these kinds of reforms than the elected officials might be, for both the reason that I outlined before, that the elected officials have gotten elected under the current system, and for this reason that that the electorate is a little less polarized, sees fewer differences between the parties, is a little less committed to those parties. Open could be appealing, but this last election sure didn't feel that way from the perspective of the electorate. And so if this is the direction we're headed, it could be that open primaries aren't as appealing. And then Megan points out, if we see actually less choice in a way from the perspective of the electorate in open primary places where there's a one-party election, that could be a problem. And I think that could be a problem particularly for those young voters that we've been talking about. I know my students are perpetually perplexed by why they only have two choices. And as many times as I talk about how the system is what creates that, they are determined that they would like a system that doesn't create that. And so I think this is another where it could cut both ways depending on our experience in these places that do experiment.
So we have another question on the Republican Congress. Now, we know that election rules and processes are generally handled at the state level. So there are limits to what the federal government can do in this area. But this person asked, how much of a focus do you expect the Republican Congress to have on election reform? And in particular on this topic, like, is it possible for Congress to ban ranked choice voting? Could they ban open primaries? What are you expecting from this Congress and President Trump on election reform?
I could start by saying I don't expect Congress to get much done period. And so I'd be surprised if this were the thing that they really took up. They're such tight margins that it's going to be very difficult, I think, to get a lot accomplished. So we'll just start with that as a baseline expectation. And then we layer on a pretty well-developed state responsibility that I think makes it very difficult. And then some real disagreement across states, as we've seen, with whether they're accepting of these kinds of reforms. And therefore, I think those incentives roll up to those legislators from those states. Again, California being a prime example.
Seth, what are you expecting from the Republican Congress and president?
I think I agree with Sarah on this. This is, I mean, while there are quite a few Republicans nationally who are opposed to these sorts of reforms, this doesn't strike me as at the top of their hit list. They have quite a few other things that I think Donald Trump is much more exercised about than this issue. And also, there's, I think, real limits on what they could actually do from the federal government. The Constitution affords states, a good deal of deference as to how they want to run their election systems. This could become a protracted issue. The Supreme Court could weigh in on whether the government can really impose this, or whether the federal government could tie some funding for elections, to, states essentially preventing, nonpartisan primaries. I doubt it's anyone's priority to make this happen, particularly as Sarah notes that, virtually all these reforms failed this year. And I don't think Republicans see this as the major threat that they see many other things, including immigration.
It's also worth noting, as we've talked about, that there is bipartisan opposition to this among people who've already won elections. So if Congress was going to take this up, they wouldn't have needed to wait for Republican control, because plenty of Democrats in Congress don't want to see this go through.
Yep, no, that is a good point. We have another question. And earlier, I think each of you mentioned how ballot reform got enmeshed with partisan politics this year. So a person asked, why has ranked choice voting become a partisan issue and largely is opposed by Republicans? And I will add a coda to that question, which is there any way to untangle this reform from partisan politics, or is this just part of the future going forward and pro-reform people are just going to have to figure out some way to deal with it?
I would say that, again, reform people, to go back to that Lauren Boebert example, that you can make that argument on the other side. And so if you're pro-reform, you need to be looking for places where progressives are winning ahead of what their electorate would want, and talk about how these reforms mean you're not going to have a squad, or you're not going to have people further to the left. I don't think they've made that argument either. It's interesting, in our state, one thing that really hit the pro initiative side was they got a big donation from Chevron. Makes sense. We have a legislature that's been fairly anti-drilling. Chevron might want to see state legislative elections where more moderate Democrats, more pro-business Democrats have a better chance. But the messaging didn't get to the voters that, hey, this might draw the legislature back from the left. Instead, the messaging that got out was, oh, Chevron wants to buy your elections. So I think, again, the people who want to see this come through need to look at what voters on both sides are unhappy with and speak very directly to it.
We have a question from somebody who lives in Arlington, Virginia, and this person notes that Arlington was one of the first local areas to use ranked choice voting in county board elections, and this person is now part of a group trying to spread this reform to other towns. And the question is, how can we take this grassroots model as a way forward to broader success? Is there a way for towns and cities to basically become at the forefront of some of these reform efforts?
I mean, I would say this is, the success that the movement has had so far has been largely because of this sort of thing. We've seen this happen in a number of cities and regions, that this is, has become popular in a number of cities in the San Francisco Bay Area, in New York, and some places in the Northeast. I don't know the exact mechanism, but there are ways that, election administrators from different parts of the country, county level officials and city officials will have, occasional national meetings about these sorts of things. And like, yes, this is how ideas spread. And I tend to think this is actually a good way forward for this movement. Many movements tend to try to start at the national level. And that is often a place where a lot of ideas die, just because they're not championed by some presidential candidate or something like that. Whereas a lot of the history of ballot reform in this country had to do with things starting at city and county levels, working their way into the state levels, and then becoming too popular to ignore after that.
That also helps to work through this voter confusion in places where it's much easier to understand, and you might know the candidates better. And so I do think that's common in lots of reform processes where the scary, confusing thing when it comes to just your hometown isn't that, and then it can spread. And completely agree with Seth that this is how ideas spread, and they do come from localized situations very often.
So we have a question about race, and specifically, how do racial features influence election reform outcomes? And just to add to that, in what ways did race play into what happened this year? Are there particular aspects of this that would create issues in terms of this reform going forward?
I'll jump in on one part of this, and I honestly don't know, and I'd be curious if anyone else here knows, how this was tied to race this year. But at least more generally, one of the concerns that has been repeatedly raised about ranked choice voting is that it's taxing, is that it asks a lot of voters. It's one thing to just simply choose the Democrat or Republican. It's another thing to have to sort of rank your favorite candidates, to actually look up information on 3 or 4 or 5 people. And that can cause some people, if it looks like it's asking too much of them, they might simply just not vote in that election. And when you have that sort of a thing, when you have something that imposes costs, those costs are not imposed equally. That becomes more taxing for people with less education, with less wealth. And that also tends to be people of color in this country, people who have less of a background in this, people who have less wealth. So all these things, it doesn't necessarily mean it's tied to race, but it's related, just invariably. So if this is a reform that actually makes it less likely that voters of color are going to turn out, that is really something reformers have to consider. I think the evidence on that has honestly been very mixed, where it's been employed. But it's definitely something to be looked into. And if it's increasing racial disparities in the electorate, that is a significant source of concern.
Yeah, I unfortunately don't think I've seen any exit polling on how the votes broke down around race, but I think there's the trusted messenger aspect that when you've got a big reform like this, people look closely at who's telling them to trust it and who's not. And to go back to something I talked about very early, county clerks in Colorado who are trusted messengers on election reliability had a lot of concerns about implementing these reforms. The measure on our ballot said they had to be in place in 2 years, which is a eye blank if you're trying to rewrite election rules. And so, one thing that I think people who want this reform have to think about is how do you get the election administrators okay with this before you put a giant change in front of them and say, make it happen? Because they are at the county level. They are the people that voters know are in charge of their elections. And so, at least in Colorado, I thought the concerns that our clerks were raising, A, were very valid and not necessarily being addressed by the people who wanted to see this changed. And B, might have been things that were messages that were getting to voters more than advocates quite realized in terms of, if you're reasonably happy with how you vote right now, do you trust that this is going to make it better?
Yeah, that is an interesting point, and you're right. In a few of the states, election administrators actually did play a role. Some of them actually came out opposed to the reform, just saying it would cost more money, it would complicate the task, we need more time to implement these types of things. So that is certainly one lesson for reformers, that they should ignore that particular group. My last question for you before we close things out is, we've talked a lot in this webinar about the opposition messaging and what worked and what seemed to resonate with voters. But there's a question: what are the most effective pro-reform messages? How can proponents sell the idea of election reform?
There are a few opportunities, I think. One, if we separate these into open primary and then secondarily the ranked choice voting or the instant runoff. Open primary, I think we can talk about, maybe we don't use the word open anymore. Maybe reformers don't use the word open, but talk about choices, right? You have more choices. And voters tend to like to think that that's what they're doing in an election, is making choices, and that they have the choices in front of them. So I think that's a winning way of talking about open primaries. I will go back to the Ireland example and say that I think I concur with Daryl's point that ranked choice voting sounds quite difficult. Again, in Ireland, it's just voting for who you prefer, getting the chance to weigh in on who you prefer. There are ways to talk about this that are not as technical, not as complicated, not as even much of a change for voters, just that they're getting to express their preferences in the ballot box.
Just jump in on this. I mean, if I knew anything about salesmanship and marketing, I'd probably be in a different line of work. But one of the things that strikes me about this, we've talked about some of the problems with voter confusion. We've talked about the problem that in some of these states, these were demonized as a California reform, and that was a problem, which I think is in some ways ironic in that, and I want to be clear about our definitions, whether we're talking about like open primaries, I think more accurately a nonpartisan primary with a top 2 or top 4 or 5 runoff. California is one of the real success stories there. Where, more than a decade ago, they adopted a top 2, a nonpartisan primary with a top 2 general election runoff. And it's one of the few places where you actually see polarization in the state legislature reducing. It was the most polarized legislature in the country. It is not anymore. And I don't know if it's possible to sort of reposition California in this whole debate, but this is actually a success story. This is a selling point. There's a reason that California Pizza Kitchen sells and something like Delaware Pizza Kitchen doesn't. Like this probably can be sold in a positive way, and actually pointing to a success story rather than just saying, doesn't this sound like a nice idea?
Although California pizza still is not as popular as Chicago pizza from a marketing standpoint. But I don't know if we want to market ballot reform from a Chicago lens. We are out of time, but I want to thank Megan, Seth, and Sarah for sharing your thoughts. You had lots of insightful comments and lots of terrific recommendations for reformers going forward. So we appreciate you taking the time. For those of you who'd like to read more details on what happened in 2024 and what are the possible lessons going forward, you can check out my paper, which is available at brookings.edu. So thank you very much for tuning in.
Okay.
Okay, terrific. You folks were amazing. Great.